All right, welcome back, everybody, to an American Discussion podcast. I am one of your hosts, Michael, and with me, as always, is Drew. How are you doing, Drew?
Doing pretty good, Mike. It's been about a week since we did this one, so I want to apologize to everyone. I went hunting this last weekend and then fell into sickness almost immediately after, so I've been out for the count. But hunting went great. Broke my streak. Dropped a little button buck. Thought it was a doe. It was actually pretty dope, dude. I went out Friday night. I found out that Michigan opened up their early season antlerless firearm. And so Friday night I had all my shit packed, took it to work with me, and then went straight up from work. When I was going to put my blind up, I got to right where I had it at last year. I was thinking about moving it up the trail a little bit, trying a new spot, but there's 3 doe literally in the field that my blind was set up last year looking at, so I was like, this is perfect. I'm setting it right back in the same spot. And then did that. I saw, I think, a total of 9 deer that night. 9 deer.
Oh, wow.
4 raccoons, 2 possums, and a couple handfuls of turkey. So wildlife was out. It was awesome experiencing it all, sitting out in the woods, seeing wildlife. I loved it. Good reset. Then I went out, woke up at 4, left my mom's cabin about 5, and I left my mom's cabin about 4:45. I was in my blind by 5:30. Shooting light started about 6:40-ish, 6:45, 7 o'clock, give or take. I watched him stroll in probably 6:55, 7 o'clock-ish. So I was still waiting for it to lighten up a little bit. Yeah, dude, it was super early. And I watched him for the better part of an hour. He meandered. At first, I only saw his ass when he came in. For those that don't hunt, whitetails are called whitetails because they have a white patch of fur on their tail and their ass. And it's the most easily identifiable part on them. Typically, I see it when they're running away from me because they saw me before I saw them. But this time I saw him stroll in. I watched him. There's like a set of twin trees, probably about 40 yards from my blind. And I'm sitting up on a berm with probably 6 foot of elevation, somewhere in there, maybe 5. So I watch him walk around the twin trees that have brush covered all around him. So I'm only seeing the upper crest of his shoulder blade and his head when he pops it up. And he was popping that bad boy up a lot. So I thought it was a doe. Didn't see any antlers, obviously. Watched it. It got spooked by a couple things down the road. There were some teenagers that could not wait to tell me at 5 o'clock in the morning about their disdain for Kamala Harris, which was interesting. I was like, dude, I'd love to have this conversation with you, not in the woods the first day I can legally shoot a deer at 5 o'clock in the morning, no.
Were they out hunting as well?
Yeah. And then they tried to roast me for I brought my ear protection out because, I like my hearing. Like, yeah, we don't do that. Yeah. I'm like, oh, okay, well, I do, so. I also carried my gun case in the field, which they thought was weird, but it has all my shit, so. Anyway, so I watched this deer for about 30-40 minutes, and he finally comes through right between the twin trees, comes up a little berm where the brush is, and then backs back down, comes around. I should have taken that shot. Goes back behind the trees and comes out a little bit to my right, and that's when I took him. I can only see probably the front 2/3 of him. Dropped him, and it went in diaphragm out back. Right, it actually blew one of the back straps apart, unfortunately. But dropped him immediately. I saw him go down immediately. Twitched a little bit. I waited. I didn't wait the 20 minutes. I know you should. 20 minutes to an hour, but went out, checked for sign of life. No breathing, no pulse, no nothing, no twitch. So I went to work, got him dressed, dragged him out. Probably about a mile drag. I forgot. This is a weird one. I forgot my plastic bag I always take with me for the heart primarily. So I left the heart in the cavity until I got to my car, and then I grabbed the bag that I had in there and took care of that. Got it home. The wife and kids were at the store getting some stuff, so I processed that. Started processing, skinning and all that. Broke down to primals, and then the wife took most of the butchering from there. Besides, we both trimmed and sized up meat for the meat grinder, but yeah, it was a good weekend. Great weekend. Until I got sick.
Nice, yeah.
What about you? How'd you go?
Yeah, well, always great to have a successful hunt. And was that your first whitetail?
Mm-hmm.
Nice. Yeah, I still haven't gotten one.
No
deer for me.
We'll have to go out this year, dude.
I did think it was funny that you had some kids out there trying to throw some shade based on the way you're out there hunting. I mean, I've done the traditional Michigan hunting way, and not all it's cracked up to be, I'd say.
Oh, I've gone out without ear pro. Actually, the shot I took last year when the round didn't go off, I was not wearing ear protection. But I changed my mind. I've shot enough guns without ear protection. I don't need to keep doing that.
Oh yeah, well there's definitely better ways than walking out there with your gun, and a jacket isn't what I would call the best method. Oh no,
I take and this is just the idea I came up with. I'm not saying it's the right way or not, but I take a external frame hiking bag, and I have like a roll up plastic sled. I'm sure you've seen them. That I put the deer on to pull them out, and I run 550 cord off of that, and I carabiner it to the frame of my pack. So I shift the weight from my arms and dragging it like an idiot to my hips, so it made the drag process way easier.
Oh yeah, no, that's a great idea.
It's game changing, dude. Well, I haven't dragged 200-pound deer out. I've dragged 200-pound men, and that shit is not fun. So I like the system. It was good. I'm going to do it in the future. I recommend it to anybody that's listening that wants to have an easier time dragging a deer. So I think it was great. I'm going to go back up this weekend and change my trail cam orientation, and I haven't decided if I'm going to take my blind down or not, but I probably should, because I blew one of the connectors off of it, so...
Yeah, no, great stuff. So happy you were able to put a little meat in the freezer.
Oh yeah.
And I mean, you got it so early that by the time I went to text you and ask how it was going, you already had one down.
Yeah, it was. And the crazy thing is, I didn't expect it to happen that quick, but I'm glad it did. I was back in my house by noon.
Oh yeah, no, I mean, earlier than deer season, nobody's out there shooting yet.
Yep.
The very first day, early season.
Before bow even. Before the rut.
They didn't know what was out there.
Yeah, he got smacked.
Yeah.
Wish it was bigger, but
no, I had a pretty good weekend as well. We went on a little rafting trip down the Muskegon River here.
Yeah, I saw the photos. That looked awesome.
Yeah, it was so fun. We took our dog Maggie as well. She did have to endure like a 2-mile bus ride to get up to where we launched.
The launch, yeah.
And she wasn't very happy about that, but once we got out on the water, she was, she loved being out there.
She swim at all?
A little stressed out, but what's that?
Did she go for a swim at all?
Yeah, she did. She wouldn't get into where she was actually like supporting herself in the water, or I guess not supporting herself, but actually swimming. She only made it out to like belly deep, but
yeah.
She did love running around in the water.
Oh, I'm sure it's scary for her too, first time.
Oh yeah, I mean she's 2 now, and she hasn't really been in the water yet.
I tried to get Milo in the water at that campground we went to, but he was not having it. He sniffed it and then immediately walked away.
Oh yeah, see, and she did the same thing when she was there.
Yeah.
But, I mean, it's the same river that campground is on too. So, no, yeah, great weekend, great way to end the summer. It was actually the last day of summer when we were out there, and then the next morning was officially fall.
Oh, was it?
So, yep. So we've been in fall for almost a week now. But, you know, I mean, still plenty to do out here in the fall. Lots of hunting, fishing.
Oh, yeah.
Fall activities, pumpkin spice lattes, pumpkin carving.
Yeah, I think we're going to...
cider mills and donuts.
Yeah, we already went to one. And we're going to Lehman's again this weekend, so... Well, the family
nice.
is, but... Yeah, it's going to be a good time.
Yeah, we take our kids to the pumpkin patch every year and do a little, you know, some fall activities, pick out our pumpkins for carving.
Yeah.
But I think we're going to add the apple orchards now. Since
there's so many, home. Yeah, you might as well.
And I always remember doing that as a kid, and it was, you know, one of my favorite things.
Yeah, what was the one we went to over in the other this side? Bayers, I think?
Oh, I don't know.
The one with that treehouse.
It's been so long.
You know what I'm talking about?
We went to so many of them growing up.
Yeah, there's that really big one. It's on a main road. I can't remember what road it's on. Anyway, that's not relevant to anyone outside of Michigan.
Yeah. Well, yeah. Sounds like we both had a pretty good weekend. Besides you getting sick from ingesting whatever nasty bug you happen to get.
Yeah, and as of today, I'm fully recovered.
Oh, perfect.
So it worked out great. One real rough day, but
well, no better time to get back at it.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and speaking of getting back at it, you have the topic for today's episode. So what are you going to discuss today, Drew?
Today I'm going to discuss the 28th President of the United States. I'm going to let my bias be known right now. I absolutely abhor this president. I think he was a horrible, I would argue, the worst president in the United States history. I do think he did some good things. A lot of those he didn't do for the right reasons, but I would like to get into that now. Might as well. So the president of discussion is Woodrow Wilson. Fuck Woodrow Wilson is the name of the PowerPoint that I made. So I'm going to give a little bit of background in it. He was born December 28th, 1856, died February 3rd, 1924, shortly after the end of his presidency. He, like I said earlier, was the 28th president between March of 1913 and March of 1921. He did serve two terms. He was born in Virginia. He was a boy of the South. He was born during the Civil War. And was raised through the Reconstruction era and all that. So his father was a very interesting character as well. He was originally from Ohio and then moved around the country quite a bit. Ended up having Woodrow Wilson, whose full name is Thomas Woodrow Wilson. He went by his middle name, which was also his mother's maiden name. Fun little trivia fact for you. But anyway, his father was a Presbyterian pastor, a staunch supporter of the Confederacy, and a professor at Columbia University, amongst other things. But those are the important ones. The ones that I think are interesting is the pastor and the Confederacy supporter.
So his father was raised in Ohio and a supporter of the Confederacy. So
yes.
Where was Woodrow Wilson born?
Virginia.
Virginia. Okay. Yeah, that makes sense from some of the things that I know about him.
Yeah. It's real interesting. So, actually, before I get into this, what do you know about Woodrow Wilson as far as like wave tops? I'm sure probably not as thorough. This is like my most hated president, so I've done quite a bit of research into him. But what do you know about him?
So off the top of my head, and again, as usual, I did not do any extra research into Woodrow Wilson before the episode.
Mm-hmm.
What I do know is that he was the president leading into World War I.
Mm-hmm.
And then he was part of the founding of the League of Nations.
Mm-hmm.
and into the United Nations. I guess I don't know if he had much of a hand in, the United Nations, but definitely the League of Nations.
Yeah. Okay. So yeah, you're right about all that so far. Obviously, he was not part of the UN. That was well after his time, but he did start the founding of it with the League of Nations. A lot on paper, Woodrow Wilson actually looks pretty decent, to be honest with you. A lot of historians tend to rank him pretty highly, typically above in the top 50 percentile, typically 25th percentile of U.S. presidents. I obviously staunchly disagree, but that's because of his paper record, right? So I'm going to list off just a few of them. You're right with the League of Nations. He also had a big hand to do in the negotiations at the end of World War I, as far as he wanted to be a little more passive to Germany, and as I'm sure you're aware, the Treaty of Versailles was not a very German-friendly treaty. It actually was very, I would argue to say petty against Germany, to an extent.
Yeah, it was very, very harsh.
Very harsh. Yeah, but he tried to fight for mercy for Germany for a multitude of reasons. Mainly because he wanted to establish his League of Nations, and he didn't think that would be very possible if we went into another global conflict. But he ended up agreeing with in signing the Treaty of Versailles as well. So, just as culpable for that. But he also was responsible for signing into law the 17th, 18th, and 19th Amendments, which I get into a little bit later. But for those that don't know, the 17th Amendment was the direct election of senators, so it took it out of the hands of the states, which we'll get into that further. The 18th Amendment, which was prohibition, and the 19th Amendment, which was women's suffrage. He also established the Fed. He established the FTC, and he established the Food Administration. So, on paper, he looks pretty good. But we'll get into reasons why he wasn't now.
Yes.
So, a little bit more... go ahead.
Oh, go ahead.
Okay, so a little bit more on his background. He was catapulted into politics. He's not a ground-up politician. He was a professor at Princeton University, became the president of Princeton University from 1902 to 1910. During this time, he adamantly dissuaded the admission of African American students. So this was really where we start seeing his first policy, quote-unquote, racism. But he had plenty of speeches, and he actually had a lot of papers that he wrote about eugenics and race purification and stuff like that, as well as the I'll get into this in the racism tab, so I'm not going to get too far into that. And then after October of 1910, by January of 1911, he became the governor of New Jersey. He was a governor from 1911 to 1913. He ran on an antitrust platform, which made him very popular at the time. There's a lot of monopolies and such at the time that were really hindering the lower economic brackets of the United States. He presented himself as a progressive, which I would argue he was. Not that was... I don't think he was a good brand of progressive, but he was a progressive nonetheless. There was a little bit of a scuffle with him in the Democratic Party at the time, because he refused to back the candidate James Smith, who actually got him into the governorship, and it actually endorsed his opponent for Congress. He passed corrupt practices and workman's comp statutes all within the first 3 months of his governorship. But not too long after that, I think it was a year or so after that, the state Senate became Republican, which pretty much gave him no authority to pass much else. So he spent most of his time vetoing bills, but he did squeak by the Seven Sisters antitrust laws, which we're not going to obviously get too much into right now, but they're just what they sound like. They're antitrust laws for the most part. And then he was U.S. president in 1913, right after he was done being governor of New Jersey. And he was, like I said earlier, president from 1913 to 1921. He did have a difficult primary process as far as that goes. I think they did 10 ballots, and he finally got in on the last one. So that pushes us into the 1912 election. I think the only reason that he won, and I think there's very little argument against this, is because this was the year of the bull moose. As I'm sure you're well aware, this is when the Republican Party they decided to decided to run the incumbent William Howard Taft, the fat president. For those of you that have heard I think it's a myth. It's been proven busted about the bathtub thing with the crane. But nonetheless, he was renowned as our fattest president. But they split the ticket between him and former president. Do you know who it is?
Roosevelt?
Yes, Teddy Roosevelt. The reason Teddy Roosevelt was not the incumbent was because he had already served 1.5 terms. Because he was a successor to a president that died. But this isn't a thing on Roosevelt, so this is just a little wicket for him. So that being said, the Republican Party was split, so obviously that split the vote. I'm going to throw out some numbers, so if you're not super political with politics, this won't sound as insane as it actually is. But Woodrow Wilson won with 42% of the popular vote. But he won 435 of the 531 Electoral College votes.
Wow.
Yes. So it's insane that he won less than half of the popular vote and won the vast majority of Electoral College votes.
If I'm getting this correct, he had just a slim majority in almost every state.
Yeah, I mean, he had a healthy majority. I think Teddy had 28 or 29% of the popular vote. So he had a 10 to 15 point lead in that, but he had way more than that as far as
split 3 ways.
Correct.
He had the majority, even though it wasn't, anywhere close to 50% of the vote.
Nowhere near. Yep.
He just had to break 30% of the vote.
Exactly, and it was crazy because obviously that never really happens. And I don't know how many times it's happened in history, but it's rare nonetheless to win 42% of the vote and end up with 81% of the Electoral College votes. Like, that's just crazy. Anyway, this resulted in a full Democrat control of their government, so House, Senate, and presidency. And for this campaign, he primarily ran on electoral and educational reform, regulating utility companies, and corruption in promises of investigating certain corruption claims. He also claimed during it that Teddy was an egotist that was running for his 3rd term, but again, we discussed that he took over for a president who died. And then, so obviously that wasn't a term. And this is before FDR sparked the actual enshrinement in law of 2 terms. So at the time, technically, you could run for as many terms as you want. But he pretty much ran saying...
The 2 terms thing was just essentially a custom, not a hard and fast rule.
Correct. Especially at this time. Now it's a rule, but then it was not. So he pretty much said that Teddy was just doing it for his ego, blah, blah, blah. Which, the interesting thing is that on policy, Teddy Roosevelt and Woodrow Wilson were not that different. They were both progressives by any measurement at all, especially at the time. But Teddy tended to be a conservative, progressive, and Woodrow Wilson obviously was not. So now we get into the darkest mark that nobody ever talks against because it's just so prolific. This is Woodrow Wilson's history with racism. So he is obviously not our most racist president in the past. I'm sure there were many more worse ones. But he's among them. He's in the conversation. So he was the foremost promoter of the lost cause myth. This was basically saying that the Civil War was based on the heroics of the South and not about slavery. We still hear some of this shit today when people, oh, it's states' rights, it's just not the case. I already talked about this. While at Princeton, he dissuaded the admission of African American students. He didn't want them in the population. He was quoted defending segregation as a, quote, a rational scientific policy, end quote. He was also, there's multiple people around him that quoted him as someone, and again, this is their quote, not me saying this, love to tell racist, quote, darky jokes about black Americans, end quote. So obviously, saying bad things about African Americans. He also, this is the most prolific one and probably the biggest dark stain on his record, is, do you know what the first screening of a film inside the White House was, Michael?
No, I do not.
You want to take a guess? It happened during this time, so.
Oh, man. No, the only thing that's coming to mind is that Disney movie that's banned.
Yeah, Birth of a Nation.
That was.
Oh wait, no, that's not the one you're talking about. But
Birth of a Nation makes sense.
But that's the answer.
That's the one that I couldn't think of.
Yeah, so he screened as our nation's first screened movie in the White House. It was Birth of a Nation, which he never originally critiqued the film. But after a lot of public backlash, he did, and then he pretty much ran, though, it's misunderstood, it's not about racism, that whole thing. There's also a famous quote from him, but I'm actually going to end the podcast on that, just so we can all keep the taste of Woodrow Wilson in our mouth and not forgive his repugnant racism. He also claimed to only capitulate to racist Senate members in order to pass legislation that, hey, I'm not a racist, guys. I'm just doing this because I won't get anything passed if I don't. But as we will move on, we'll see that is not the case. So he appointed 9 African Americans to prominent federal positions that were traditionally reserved for African Americans at the time. However, 8 of those were carryovers from the Taft administration. So he appointed 1. He also fired 15 of the 17 black supervisors in the federal bureaucracy immediately upon taking office. So he added 1 black member to prominent position and then got rid of the vast majority of everyone else. And what's important about that, especially at this time, it'd be a horrible thing now to fire someone just on their race, but it's especially bad at the time because this is a time where it's in between slavery and the civil rights era, right? So this is peak Jim Crow, peak segregation of the South of the country, which Woodrow makes worse. And the federal government was one of the few places where African American citizens at the time could get some semblance of equality. Obviously, it wasn't equal, but they got some semblance of being treated like everyone else. And he did not allow any of them to be hired, any African Americans to be hired for the vast majority of federal positions. I've heard a story about one where it involves building a cage around a guy, but I haven't been able to figure that. I haven't looked that one up yet. But basically, it sounds as though they couldn't make the facility segregated because of something about the building. So instead, they had to cage in this black guy's office. That way, he could still go to work because they couldn't technically fire him. Anyway, crazy. I haven't verified that yet, so that's just hearsay. But interesting one that I came across. He never directly segregated the federal government. However, he gave the leniency to all of his cabinet members. So, Secretary of Defense, the Attorney General, all of them, all of their cabinets, they could segregate as they wished, and most of them did very heavily. He also heavily increased segregation within the U.S. military. The only branch that never formally segregated was the U.S. Navy. However, it did institute Jim Crow on bases, ships, all that type of thing, and essentially made African Americans responsible for almost solely mess and janitorial duties, custodial duties, whatever you want to call them. So, as you're well aware, the shit jobs on the ship.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, it was horrible. Then during the race riots of 1917 and 1918, Woodrow Wilson at this point was actually in Europe, going over it, trying to pitch the League of Nations thing. At which point he tried to not get involved with the race riots. He has that in multiple journal entries where he's trying to evade taking a stance. Right, he's more focused on his 14 points, which I'll pull up here in a minute, but. And he really didn't want to bother too much with it. But there's a insurmountable amount of public outcry from him not taking action, as there should be, when the president of the nation doesn't address race riots in the nation. And he asked his attorney general to, and this is a quote, check these disgraceful outrages. So I'm not sure if you got the whole flavor of the full context of that, but his position was not, we need to make race relations better. It was, we need to stop this from a law and order standpoint.
Shut this down.
Yeah, we need to get these riots shut down. Not, hey, they might have a point, we should really consider the social fabric of the country. Nothing like that. It was literally just, hey, law and order is more important than your feelings. Stop it. And he said the same thing about lynching, that they needed to stop it from a law and order standpoint. Not that it was wrong, but that it was wrong to commit crimes in public, is essentially what he did. He also didn't get involved in the 1919 riots that happened later, after his stroke. Here I'm going to get into a couple of his other, what I consider sins. This is where, that concludes the racial part that I put together on this one. Obviously, he has a bunch of papers that he's published, like I said, on eugenics and forced sterilization for the mentally unfit and for racial genetic cleansing. That racial genetic cleansing is his words, not mine. But, those are things that I don't want to dig too much into. Obviously, that's something that we can discuss at length later if we want, or, look it up in your spare time. But if you can trust me about one thing in this, it's that Woodrow Wilson was a racist. There's ample documentation on it, and it's abhorrent, right? So, of the other sins, the creation of the Federal Reserve, I consider this a sin. I don't know how you feel about the Federal Reserve, but I think it was the biggest piece of legislation and the biggest institution that we put in place to limit the free market. I tend to be a pretty heavy believer in free markets. I obviously believe there should be some sort of regulation in the cases of monopolies and things like that. But for the most part, I think market should dictate. So he did that. He also raised the national debt. He's the second place for percentage increase, with a percentage of 724% increase of the debt, bested only by I might have just given it away, but do you know who the number one is?
Sounded like you were going to say FDR, which would make sense.
Yes, it was, which does make sense because he did expansive progressivism to get us out of the Great Depression and as a result of the World War. So I'm not sure how you feel about that Federal Reserve point. I don't know if you want to put in yours.
I think that it made sense with a growing economy to, shift to something that gave the federal government a little bit more control over volatility of the market. Not that it necessarily was a silver bullet for that, as we'll see later in history. But I can't say that it was just a terrible idea. So, especially with what they had to go off of at the time.
So my reason for thinking it's a sin is actually how it was constructed, and it was basically a cabal of private bankers got together and came up with a genius way where they could essentially print money and insure themselves through the federal government, thus taking away their liability and allowing for a lot of the banking issues we still see today. So I think in principle, I think this is the way with a lot of Woodrow Wilson's things, is the thought of it is good. The execution is piss poor and often done for the wrong reasons. But this one I think he believed to be an actual good thing. And I think that this can be debated as good or bad depending on which side of the aisle you sit on. I don't think this is a morally abhorrent thing, in my opinion. So I think I'm being fair there.
And I would probably agree with what you're saying if I did a little bit more research on how the Federal Reserve itself was, constructed, and some of those loopholes that have persisted until today. I would almost guarantee it goes all the way back to that, like you're saying, and obviously I think that's bad.
Yeah, but I think his intent was understandable at this point. I disagree with it. I don't agree with the regulation of free market for the most part, but that's a difference in political opinion, not me saying he's a bad person because he believed this way, right? So that's Federal Reserve. Another one is the unauthorized military occupation of the Dominican Republic and Haiti. Anything that you think those two countries have in common?
When you say that, I immediately think of like the Banana Republic, kind of deal. But there was also, I don't know if it was at this time, but there were some oil deposits in those areas, as well as rubber, that kind of stuff. So really, my best guess is cash crops that the United States wanted more control over.
So that's actually not what it was for. It was for actually a couple of different reasons, mostly uprisings in the area. But one thing that they happen to have in common is the very large black population for both countries, which kind of I'm not saying, I don't think there's any proof to prove that's why he did it specifically, but paired with all of his other racism, I don't see how you can't involve it in the conversation. But I digress. Another thing with another one of the sins, he ran for his second term on neutrality in the World War. It had already been going on at this point. We weren't involved yet, but he ran for neutrality, and then he joined the war anyway. Now, again, in his defense, I didn't think I was going to have this many points in defense of Woodrow Wilson because I hate him so much, but I want to be fair and honest. Had his opponent, Teddy Roosevelt, won, we most certainly would have gone to war sooner, right? So if the goal is to not go to war at all, I guess he was the lesser of the two, because if you know anything about Teddy Roosevelt, he was a very aggressive man. He coined the phrase, speak softly and carry a big stick. And he did flex that big stick, as can be seen with his history with the Rough Riders and so on. But his big campaign promise, like 90% of his campaign, was that we were going to stay out of World War I, and he broke that. He also sent 4,000 federal troops into Mexico in pursuit of Pancho Villa, which I think was a horrible idea. And Congress ended up ordering those troops back to America. He also was originally against suffrage. There's multiple reasons for that. It kind of stemmed from the inferiority of females through his perspective. But he ended up caving due to public backlash, and also he caved, and this is a really interesting time as well. I say caved, I don't mean it negatively. I agree with women's suffrage. I think that women should have the right to vote and be equal citizens to men. But at the time, this was a hotly contested issue. So he caved to the suffragists, largely in part to the labor shortage during World War I. This is where we see the Rosie the Riveter things, and the my wife actually brought one up that I forgot about, the Radium Girls. I'm not sure if you're familiar with them.
Oh, yes, absolutely.
Yeah, so you're more than welcome to take this one. It sounds like you might have a little more information than me on it. I just have a general understanding of it.
So Radium Girls, the kind of quintessential or classic example of this is people painting radium dials on watches, which was generally done by women, because They were seen to have more artistic and steady hands than men. But they were dipping these paintbrushes in a radioactive solution and then painting the watch faces. They would often, like lick the paintbrush to get that fine tip on it again. And they were essentially being exposed to these occupational hazards, all of this occupational radiation exposure. That it's a pretty classic example along the lines of The Jungle by Upton Sinclair with the slaughterhouses for labor protections in the United States.
Yeah.
But yes, to your point, a job almost exclusively done by women, and it was a huge bolster to the United States manufacturing economy.
Yes. And so that's great explanation, better than I could have. The only thing I remembered was the watch faces and that they used to lick the brushes to regain the point. So much better summarization than me, so thank you for that. But I said all that to say that he did it for political gain, not necessarily for caring about women. And you see that with a lot of his things. He tends to cave to public outcry instead of sticking to his morals. So there's that. He also, I already said, was pro-eugenics. But I think it's important to say that again. For those of you that don't know what eugenics is, it's basically the manipulation of a population to get certain genetic traits that you want to be propagated within the society. Most commonly, it's done on racial. The Nazis also were proponents of eugenics against the Jews and mentally handicapped, also black people. It's, deplorable thing, no matter pretty much any way you look at it. So,
and it was proposed to be done in a variety of ways by both sterilization of what they would consider bad genes or people that carried bad genes. So as you were saying, like racial and religious fixations with that, and then promotion of coupling or marriage between people that they would say have beneficial genes, almost like animal husbandry in that
way. So another thing that another one of his sins is the 17th Amendment. I personally am against the 17th Amendment. I think that the Founding Fathers were brilliant in their forming of the government. Say what you will about their personal decisions and how they live their personal lives. I think that the founding documents were brilliant. They took human nature more into consideration than I think any other constitution, at least that I've seen. There could be something out there that I'm not familiar with, obviously, but I think they did a good job setting it up. And I think originally, for those of you that don't know, the states decided who the senators were. So the House of Representatives was direct election from the population, and then the state houses would then send senators to D.C. And the 17th Amendment did away with that. I tend to not agree with the rewriting of founding documents, but that it's something that happened, and that's why he's a progressive. That's just a fundamental disagreement I have with that side typically, but specifically with Woodrow Wilson. He also did the 18th Amendment, which was prohibition, which, as we know, led to a giant wave of crime, as well as imprisoning of American citizens for something that we now know is dumb to imprison them for. And the really interesting thing about this one, about the 18th Amendment, is that Woodrow Wilson claimed to be a son of liberty, that he found liberty and freedom to be of his highest values, and then he had these racist ideas, and he agreed with prohibition to deal with the consequences of drunkenness, I believe was the quote, but I don't have that one written down, so that's not a direct quote. Which both of those, I think, again, 17th and 18th were bad amendments. So I think, bad job on him. The next one, this is one that I think a lot of people don't know about. And I think it's one of the worst things he did for the country, at least at the time. And that's the establishment of the income tax. So before this time, there had been one income tax prior during the Civil War to pay for the war. But other than that, our country was completely run on tariffs, essentially. There was no state income tax. There's no federal income tax at all. So the reason I think this was a horrible decision, and I know you and I are probably going to disagree here, and that's fine. And this is a problem that I tend to have with the progressive movement as a whole. And why I push back hard against a lot of their ideals when they try to get stuff passed and they say, "Oh no, you're taking this out of perspective. We just want this little inch." When the federal income tax was established during Woodrow Wilson's presidency, it was for a 1% income tax on the top bracket of incomes in the country. So a very small percentage of the population paid 1%. At its peak, I think the federal income tax got up to 91% at the top bracket, and now it sits lower than that, but it's still not great. All right, so I think this is a perfect example of how when you let certain ideals get any kind of footing, they run away. I'm sure you have a rebuttal to that, Mike.
Well, I mean, I would say that's a classic slippery slope argument. But I do take your point that certain things can be perverted or enacted poorly. I don't necessarily disagree with a federal income tax, especially at this time. I think that tariffs served a great purpose at a time when trade options were limited, but as the global economy expands, tariffs become I guess I should say blanket tariffs become less and less effective as people have more trade partners. Now targeted tariffs can be very effective, as we have actually seen with some of the tariffs that Donald Trump imposed. They have by all accounts, seem to be very effective in their goal. But yeah, blanket tariffs like that I don't think could raise money on the scale needed to support a modern economy. So I think we would have gotten there one way or another, or by just imposing some other federal tax, whether that be transportation, property tax, something like that. But
things we also have nowadays.
Yeah, but on a federal level, and they would make up that difference in money somehow. So even if we didn't have an income tax, they'd take it out of your property tax, and then wherever the federal government wasn't taking their money, that's where your local government comes. So
yeah, so
I think we would end up with the people footing about the same amount of the bill in some shape or form.
So I don't disagree with your statement that in current times it's kind of necessary. I disagree with the income tax being a foregone conclusion from the get. So your premise,
just to address that really quick, I don't think it's a foregone conclusion. I think that there was some system that was necessary. Income tax just seems to be what they chose. And again, like I said, they could have chosen a federal property tax or transportation tax, some sort of thing like that. I'm not arguing in support of specifically that type of tax. Just to kind of add a disclaimer to what I was saying.
So no, absolutely, and thanks for the clarity. My issue with that argument is that our government is vastly oversized now, and I think throughout American history, we tend to cover up spending problems and call them income problems. And this has caused our national debt to balloon. This has caused a lot of the economic problems that we currently have, I think, because we spend money before we have it. And I think it's a backward system that you wouldn't do in your own household. Well, I guess a lot of Americans now do because the state of the economy and the fact that our private debt consumption is way up. Not that any of this is Woodrow Wilson's fault, because credit wasn't even a thing until the 80s. So, but however, I think this is another problem that I have with the progressive movement, is that they often extend over their skis as far as spending goes, and with the size of the government and government impact in everybody's lives. So I tend to disagree almost categorically with expanding the government to a size and then bleeding the money out of the population. I think if the government was much smaller, tariffs would have been a much better option, much more viable option at least. Obviously, like you said, targeted sanctions, blanket sanctions would have worked to an extent if they were low, or not sanctions, tariffs would have worked if they were a low-level tariff, and then you have more specific ones that you layer on top. But for the vast majority of our country's history, it was run on tariffs. Now, globalism is a discussion to have, but I don't really think it's as big of a component, seeing as our nation was founded during the globalization period, right? And we literally, our country is built on land that we didn't know was part of the globe until relatively recently at the time. So,
but as a counterpoint to that, what was happening around the time of Woodrow Wilson with regard to international commerce? You had steamships, the Panama Canal, and all of these other projects beginning to, take shape. Railroad systems and all of these different transportation networks were becoming more advanced.
Yeah, everywhere the world got a lot smaller. I'll definitely give you that.
Even by 1915, you had a much more interconnected system for international shipping.
Agreed. However, global trade was still a thing, and for the vast majority of our history, we did not have an income tax, and we found ways around it, mainly by keeping the government small, which is in the founding documents that they didn't want a huge government, but not what we're here talking about. We're talking about Woodrow Wilson, right? So that was my fault. I got us a little off, but I'm going to Billy Mays you right now, but wait, there's more. Another thing that I think was a sin.
20 ounces of liquid.
Dude, I thought about that while I was sick, and I'm sure you can figure out why.
You're cleaning up your kitchen counter with a Zorby?
Nope, it was going the other way. Yeah. I gave it one push, and I thought, 20 ounces of liquid. I was like, why?
Oh, man, I thought you were going to just say it all right there. Okay,
nope.
we can move on from that discussion.
Yep. So, another big thing that Woodrow Wilson did, and we've already touched on this a couple times, is he often rewrote history to fit his narrative. And he did that predominantly within the Civil War era to justify the Confederacy, right? Another problem that he has, and this is one that I think Trump teeters around with, I think all politicians really do, but Trump especially, is they have a savior complex where they think that they're an almighty being sent down to save us dullards from ourselves. And I just don't tend to like that in politicians. And Woodrow Wilson was a master in his field, we'll say, as far as savior complexes go. But now we get into what I think you and I can agree on is one of, if not the worst things that Woodrow Wilson had done. And these are the Espionage and Sedition Acts. Are you familiar with those at all?
I recognize the name, and I'm sure I would recognize the content, but I can't recall off the top of my head
Yeah.
what the specific things they're about are.
Yeah, so this was the biggest broach, I think, of free speech. One of the biggest in our history, right? And what makes it one of the biggest is, I'll get to in a second. So the Espionage Act made it illegal to speak out about the war, the government, the military, and a few other things. And this is still on the books to this day. The Sedition Act imposed really harsh penalties for the criticization of the government, and this was used mainly against anti-war activists, socialists, and pacifists at the time of World War I. And that ended up being repealed in 1920. However, thousands of Americans got sent to prison for speaking up against the war. Thousands. They were then released by Teddy Roosevelt when he came in office again, but that, we're talking about Woodrow Wilson being a bad person, not the person that righted his wrongs. So a lot of the original people that were arrested for this ended up appealing to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court said that it wasn't a violation of First Amendment right, which I think we can all agree it's a violation of a First Amendment right to not be able to criticize your government, right? I think it shows pretty healthily that while the Supreme Court is the supreme law of the land, they are not the arbiters of morality, and sometimes they get it wrong. Another thing about the income tax that I didn't mention that I should have is that he promised that it would only last through the war, and here we are, almost 100 years later, and it's still here and roaring just as strong as ever. But, sorry, I had to get that out before I came back to Espionage Sedition Act. How do you feel about the acts?
So I just looked into kind of the brief summary of each of those while you were discussing that.
Mm-hmm.
And I did see what you were talking about the Supreme Court ruling that, people convicted under those acts were not, having their freedom of speech violated. And one of the specifics that I read was that the issue with the freedom of speech, First Amendment rights, really comes down to people speaking out in support of enemies of the United States during wartime specifically. Now, I think we can all agree that that would be pretty awful to see people out protesting in support of the people that we're at war with. So you could think,
I mean, I would argue against that now.
World War II, people out protesting in support of, Hitler and the Third Reich, or, Japan, saying, hey, those people should win the war, not the United States. And I think we would all feel a pretty big gut reaction to that. But I think you and I can both agree that, they should be allowed to do that unimpeded.
I agree.
Really, as long as they're not breaking any laws or causing harm to national security by...
So technically they are breaking the Espionage Act at that point. So I agree. I think that, and I feel that way about present day as well, right? I think that you and I both agree in the Israel-Hamas discussion that Hamas is a terror group. I think we both said that already. And I can't speak for you, but I at least think for sure that they are a terrorist organization. But I also think that if you want to go out and march for their cause, obviously this is a proxy war. This isn't like a world war. Granted, it's different, but I think it's the same premise. I think that if you want to go out and march for Hamas, I disagree with you vehemently, but I think that's well within your rights to go do so. I think that's one of the beautiful things about our country, and I think free speech is specifically designed to protect speech that we don't like, because you don't need to protect speech that we all like. Same thing with... what was that organization? Why can I not think of them right now? The one that fought
KKK?
No. The
Confederacy.
No, they're the free speech. They started as the free speech group, and they banded together to protect the Nazi.
Greenpeace.
No, they stand together to fuck.
Mythbusters.
No, ACLU. Got there.
Okay.
How they protected, they fought in the courts to protect the speech of Nazi sympathizers. Because they said, hey, you don't have to agree with it, but they should have every right to say it, and that's what ended up happening. So this is the bulk of the bad things that I think he did. I'll go over the wave tops, the ones I think were the worst. Number one, and this is his racism, his blatant racism and desire to pacify the country, quote-unquote pacify the country of African Americans. I think it's abhorrent, and obviously I think we can all agree that that is not beliefs that we want to get behind for a president. Obviously, the culture, you can't judge history based on modern standards, but a lot of writers at the time even said that he was blatantly racist. And when they're saying in the times, it tells me that he was probably pretty bad, even by the standards of his day. Next, I think, is the income tax. I think that was the second worst thing he did, especially because it was built on the lie that it would end after the war, and it didn't. Then I think you get into the 17th and 18th Amendment and the Federal Reserve. I kind of put all those together as his worst things. Again, I'm sure we can disagree on a couple of those, but those are my big ones that I really hate him for. Oh, sorry, and the First Amendment violations. That would probably be right below racism. I'd say it's probably tied for racism, actually, in my mind. I think they're both equally horrible. I think once you stifle somebody's speech, you stifle them as a human being. Then, if you can't be in control of your own thoughts and your words, then what human rights do you actually have? But that's just my belief on freedom of speech. So, good things that I think he did was establish the FTC, the Federal Trade Commission. And I think that is the only reason I think that's important. Not because I necessarily agree with how bloated the FTC is now, or how much control they have, but I think it was important for the ability to bust monopolies and trusts apart for fair trading practices. Another thing I think he did...
Yeah, and we talked about that in an earlier episode, the FTC and the Clayton Antitrust Act. I don't think I connected the dots that was Woodrow Wilson that signed those into law.
Yeah, like I said, he did some good things, which is why the historians tend to rank him higher than the rest of the public does. He also signed into enshrined in the Constitution women's suffrage. Again, we discussed on he didn't do it for the right reasons. He did it because he was essentially forced to, but nonetheless, he did it. So I will give him credit for that. He also established the Food Administration, which I think is weird, right? I tend to dislike the Food Administration, but I think it did the things that it does right enough to outweigh a lot of the things I think it does wrong. So what the Food Administration did, and what it was designed for at the time, was to ensure that there was enough food for the troops and for the European allies and for the American citizens, right? But some of the things that it did, I think, are pretty bad. It also facilitated the transportation of food across the country. It set up logistics pipelines for that to happen. But those things, I think, are great. It also prevented the hoarding from monopolies of food to manipulate pricing. So I think those are good things that it did. Bad things, I think it gave too much government control over food to the people. It's a big reason why a lot of states can't fucking collect rainwater for some reason, amongst other things. as like the subsidization of the milk industry. It also subsidized the wheat industry in order to stabilize wheat prices at the time. That way they could, like I said, feed Europeans and all that. I think that's a bad thing to do. But nonetheless, they did it. They also implemented concepts like meatless Mondays and wheatless Wednesdays, where they told you couldn't eat meat on Mondays or wheat on Wednesdays. So, it has its good and its bad, but I think overall it was a good thing for him to do. Yeah. So those are the three.
Yeah, don't forget the subsidizing the corn crops as well.
Yes, which
that's a big one that I'm sure you're pretty passionate about these days.
Oh, which way do you think I'm passionate about it? I'm curious.
Oh, just in the fact that subsidization of corn, in particular, has led to corn being so cheap that they've refined it into
yes,
like corn syrup solids, high fructose corn syrup, all these different things, which they're now. It's so cheap that they're just putting it into all of our processed foods.
Yep. I'm glad you do know me, Michael, because that is exactly why I'm mad at that.
You and I are passionate about some of the same things.
Yes, it's fucking horseshit, and I think that it's one of the things that is killing our nation, and I think it's a big reason for the chronic illnesses that our country has. I think most of it is diet-based, especially if you look back into the times prior to high fructose corn syrup and things. And this has been a problem that's been slowly growing ever since the Food Administration, right? And as we learned how to process seed oils better and better and better, and as well as other forms of grain such as corn, and we started to have that surplus, that's when they started putting it into the food. So you can kind of see from the 60s and 70s, right when this shit starts rolling out, all of our chronic illnesses, especially in children, start skyrocketing, particularly in the 80s and 90s, where you're starting to get kids with much higher rates of things like diabetes or autism or congenital defects, or all of these litany of things, ADHD, all that stuff. All these illnesses that we have nowadays did not exist en masse in the past like they did. And the argument of the science wasn't there yet isn't really fitting, because we have the numbers prior to that of those diseases. So we knew those diseases existed, we knew how to measure them, and we did measure them. I'm absolutely against it.
I'd be hesitant to lump autism in with that group, but I do agree with what you're saying. Generally, those psychiatric illnesses or mental disorders, those are much harder to pin down and had different definitions. People were grouped in with different things. They just called those kids, mentally handicapped, retarded, whatever you wanted to classify them as at that time.
And I can see that,
like official diagnoses or diagnoses.
I can see that argument as well. I don't think there's enough evidence to back that, to prove that such significant leap as far as numbers go for how many more cases there are now than there was. I don't think that theory fleshes that whole thing out, right?
No. I'm not saying you're wrong. I definitely think that it's very, very possible that we'll see sometime in the next 5 to 10 years that autism does have some sort of environmental factor. Although one thing that's pretty consistent with autism research is that it's present from birth, so that it would be an environmental factor that's impacting the parents of those children.
I think it's a prenatal issue for the most part. That can be exacerbated afterwards, is my personal belief.
Now, to bolster your point here, if you look at incidence of cancer,
skyrocketed.
Certain types of cancer have skyrocketed recently. One of the big ones being colorectal cancer, which I guess you and I both have some pretty strong ties to
Mm-hmm.
in our family. That one is almost certainly environmental based, and
Mm-hmm.
that includes exposure to toxins as well
Yeah,
as
like
food,
phthalates and all that.
toxins in your food.
Yep. Phthalates,
Yeah, poor diet.
microplastics, seed-based oils, all that type of stuff. Yeah.
Yeah, and I mean, just now we're learning about the impacts of these microplastics and PFAS and PFAs and all of these kind of things that have flown under the radar. I mean, we've known about dioxins and the Agent Orange byproducts for years, just because we lived downstream from the chemical processing
Yeah.
plant that made that kind of thing. But it wasn't some kind of widespread thing that every American knew and avoided ingesting. And people weren't getting groundwater studies done and
Mm-hmm.
all these kinds of things,
And
studying
unfortunately,
their food.
I mean, it's a good thing that we're starting to look into these things. It's unfortunate the way history repeats itself, though, and how we get to the point of reviewing it is that hundreds of thousands of Americans had to die in order for us to even notice this as a problem. That's one thing. Obviously, this is a little kind of an oblique shift in topic, but I think that this is one of the things that I really, really, really liked about RFK is that he brought a lot of light to this issue, this modern issue that we have. And say what you will about his vaccines stance, I'm more than happy to argue that stance. To the best of my knowledge, at least.
I will. I will say. I will say.
Go
But
ahead.
I do agree with you that he did bring some very important topics to light with these big ag, big pharma,
Yes.
As well as climate change issues that I frankly a lot of politicians are ignoring on both sides of the aisle.
Yeah. No.
That I think the American people, it's something that overall we're passionate about.
Yeah, I think he brought to light a lot of issues that I think a lot of Americans, I would argue the majority of Americans think that we should solve above a lot of the issues that we're currently dealing with. A lot of the issues we're working through right now are, if you're not into politics, then this might not make sense, but we're talking low percentage issues, right? Like 15-20% issues. Meanwhile, these 80% issues, like big pharma, like big ag, like all of the food processing, all of that stuff, where they're 80% issues. So that means 80% of the population agrees that these are issues. We're just ignoring. We're just letting it go. I think it's pretty obvious why. Those same people that are responsible for those giant issues are also some of the biggest political donors in the world. So I can see why.
There you have it.
Yeah.
Follow the money.
It's just infuriating that that's the case.
Now, I would absolutely love to do a total dedicated episode to, kind of the FDA and EPA issues, or even just big ag and the food industry as a whole and how that's impacting American health.
Mm-hmm.
And I know you probably would like to do an episode on RFK Jr.
Yeah, I think he's great.
I think those are all great topics to do in the future. I do have a couple of things that I wanted to say on the topic at hand, but did you have anything else to finish out?
So all I have left prepared is the quote, but I want to save that as the last word on Woodrow Wilson because I want to really drive home how much of a fucking racist he is.
Okay. Well, in that case, a couple of things I wanted to say about Woodrow Wilson, just based on the discussion that we've had so far. My first note actually goes all the way back to your opening sentences about Woodrow Wilson. being with the Treaty of Versailles. So I think that Woodrow Wilson's handling of the Treaty of Versailles, as you presented it, was probably very astute of him to be a little bit more, I don't want to say soft, but
merciful
and kind of compromising with the German government at the time. I think these really hard stances that you find and these harsh penalties
directly led to World War II.
Stripping away, the German military power, all of these things, and, control of the German government, that it pretty directly leads to, the radicalization of the German government and, significant portion of the population, obviously leading into World War II. And we've seen this time and time again. You even see it with parenting, like if you harshly punish a child for certain things to the point where, they don't even see the point in complying, they're just gonna act out and do the opposite of what you wanted. So that I would say was the first thing that I noticed.
So on that, the reason that he tended to be more lenient, and I actually forgot to circle back and cover the 14 points, but it was...
You're about to say that he sympathized with the German cause for eugenics. That would make total sense, and I take back what I said.
So I haven't found proof of that. I would not be surprised if I did find it. I honestly have not gone looking for it. But he was more focused throughout this entire period, which he really lapsed on the First World War, and I should have drilled into this a little more, and I didn't, so I apologize. Because he wanted to get across his 14 points. That was his big thing. He didn't give a shit about anything else besides his 14 points. I'm going to read those 14 points off real quick. A lot of them are just boundary issues as far as shaping countries and things like that, right? First is open up diplomacy without secret treaties. He wanted to get rid of secret treaties amongst nations and bring them to a global level. He wanted economic free trade on the seas during war and peace. He wanted equal trade conditions. He wanted to decrease armaments among all nations. Haha, dummy, didn't happen. We went the opposite direction. He wanted to adjust, not eradicate, but adjust colonial claims. He wanted the evacuation of all Central Powers from Russia and allow it to define its own independence. He wanted Belgium to be evacuated and restored. He wanted the return of the Alsace-Lorraine region in all French territories. So he wanted all the land that Germany took from France given back to France. He wanted to readjust the Italian borders and shift how that went. He wanted Austria-Hungary to be provided an opportunity for self-determination. So that, for those of you that don't know, that was a large portion of the German Empire, was Austria-Hungary. So just so everybody's familiar with phraseology of the time. I don't even think it was called Germany back then. I think that's a post-World War II thing. No, that's post-World War I. Sorry. He also wanted to redraw the borders of the Balkan region, creating Romania, Serbia, and Montenegro. He wanted the creation of a Turkish state with guaranteed free trade in the Dardanelles. Don't know where that is, to be completely honest. Creation of an independent Polish state, and the creation of the League of Nations were his 14 points. So his big thing was he was focused on these 14 points. That's why he tried to be lenient with Germany, but he ended up caving for that exact reason, that he wanted more of his 14 points and ended up giving concessions to the other allied nations who had been directly impacted by this war, literally in their backyard. He gave them that in order to get his League of Nations, which funnily enough, after the Allies agreed to the League of Nations and a bunch of countries joined the League of Nations, it came back to America and Congress refused to sign it into law, so America never joined the League of Nations that Woodrow Wilson squandered a large portion of his presidency for. So yeah, fuck you, nerd. I also
didn't work out super well.
No, I also. That's what you get for turning your back on the American people. You don't get your toy, you don't get your glory, which is what the League of Nations was for him. It was his way to write his name in stone, right? Another thing I didn't address because while a lot of people talk about it, I don't find it particularly helpful. He did have a stroke in his later years, in the last 2 years of his presidency. His wife also died. And then a year later, he married who everyone thought was just his wife the whole time, or everyone nowadays thinks was his wife the whole time, Edith Wilson. His wife had been dead less than a year before him and Edith Wilson got married again. Edith Wilson actually met him on the campaign trail. So, yeah. And then she ended up, signing a bunch of the bills and while he was, quote-unquote, recovering and so on and so forth. But I'm talking about how much I hate Woodrow Wilson, not Edith Wilson. So I kind of left her out for the most part. But sorry, back to your points. I didn't mean to cut you off there.
Oh no, definitely. That's very interesting, and I think those first few major points that you made, I think still ring true with American foreign policy these days.
But free trade on the seas is a big one. I think that's huge, and I think that's something that America, with being the strong arm of the world that we are, I think we need to guarantee that.
Yeah, absolutely, and I think that's something, I definitely know a lot about, and I'm passionate about discussing. I think we do a good job of, maintaining that open line of trade throughout the world without being too big of a international bully that we're creating enemies. But my next point was going to be that based on those foreign interventions in Haiti and Nicaragua, was it?
Dominican Republic.
Dominican Republic. Okay. That was all part of a series of campaigns known as the Banana Wars. So it was those, banana republics and sugar cane plantations. American companies had tons and tons of foreign investments in those countries. So, there's quite a bit of evidence that those interventions were based on the interests of American businessmen, not just the United States government, although you can make an argument that, American economic holdings are part of American national security or national interests. But it seems like a pretty blatant foreign intervention for our own economic gain there.
Yeah, and oddly enough, one of the most well-known and most loved amongst Marines was Dan Daly, and he actually wrote a whole book on the Banana Wars, basically saying the same thing, that we fought those wars just to fatten the pockets of businessmen, not for moral reasons.
I think that's definitely something we can look back on, and maybe we'll even have some recent examples of that in U.S. history these days.
Oh, we definitely do. Most wars.
Fight. Time will tell. But we're running out of time here.
Yeah, sorry. Go ahead and get to your points. I apologize.
We're not gonna have as much time as I had hoped for this, but I did want to do a little thought exercise.
Yes, lay it on me.
And I think we can both agree that based on the biography of Woodrow Wilson as we have presented it today, he seems like a pretty terrible human being, and not somebody that anyone should look up to as, any kind of, hero or figure to aspire to be. But what I will say is, despite being a terrible person, if he, as you said, saw the changing social landscape of the United States and begrudgingly went along with the will of the people and, the rest of the government, the House and the Senate, and passed all of these different, beneficial or things that, the people wanted, whether or not they turned out to be beneficial pieces of legislation. Do you think that that is a good quality in a leader, or do you think that going against his own, personal moral compass makes him, kind of fake and just kind of wanting political gain?
Yeah, so you and I have had this conversation before, so I think you already know where I'm going to lay on this one. I tend to believe that you should vote for somebody that your morals align more with, or at least your policy prescription morals, if that's a thing at all, align with more, and then you trust them to do the job. So no, I don't think pandering to a group is particularly better. I also think that for the most part, the most vocal component within the nation tends to be a small component. So I don't necessarily think it's beneficial. That's why I think it's more important to lead off your morals and elect people off of policy morality, opposed to them just being part of a party. It's a big reason why, while I am a libertarian, obviously we don't win elections, so if it's not even going to be a close one, I'm not going to typically vote for an libertarian in a general, but I will vote for them down ticket for sure. But I think that you make yourself much less reliable, and a person in that position is much less reliable. Thus, it weakens democracy if you tend to just cave on your policy morality as soon as you get in. Now, I do see the argument for they're the president of the United States, not just the president of the people that elected them, and I get that too. But that's the point of having parties, is that you're electing someone that tends to align more with your political morality than doesn't. So, for example,
I agree with what you're saying, and he was.
Also, his morality was shit. I just want to point that out. I don't agree with what he said.
No.
So I'm glad he did flip flop, but I don't think that in general flip flopping is a good thing.
I understand what you're saying, and I do think that, if you look back at it at the time, if you did not include women, and you took a popular vote on women's suffrage at the time, I don't think that you would have had a majority of men voting for that. So I think that them signing that into law was the right thing to do, even though, their voting population wasn't necessarily the majority in favor of that.
I'd have to look into that. I don't know that to be the case.
That's just off the top of my head, just my assumption. I think, if anything, it was probably 50-50 on the men at the time. Perhaps there was overwhelming support, but if that's the case, I would imagine that it would have gotten done even sooner than it did. But my main point that I wanted to make was that the best leaders that I've ever known have listened to the feedback that they get, and put aside their own ideas about how things should be done, and listen to the people and then make a good decision based on their experience. And obviously it's not going to be 100% the demand of the people that are asking for such and such thing, but they can find some common ground and deliver on the expectations of the people that they are leading, while at the same time making good decisions based on the things that those people don't necessarily see. So, putting aside their own, I guess, views and making a good decision based on what's good for everyone involved.
Yeah, but that's where I think it comes to, is what makes a good decision for everyone involved. I think that comes down to your morality.
Now that is another good question. Do you base it on the historical outcome? Are we looking at it from a hindsight is 2020 type of point of view, or are we saying, was that the right thing to do because that's what the American people wanted and that was a good decision for the political climate at the time, and matching both of those things up? Or was it, like you said, was it just pandering for votes in the next election? Was it appeasing donors, those type of things? Because I could have a very different view based on which one of those it was.
Yeah, and that's, I think, a big problem I have with that whole grace that you tend to give much more so than I do, is I think that it's easy for people at upper echelons to shroud their reasons for their decisions in the more noble, quote-unquote, reasons. They could do it to pander to their donors, but then say, hey, the rest of the country thinks this way, so I think that's what we're going to do. It's just too easy to give them a scapegoat when you do that, and I tend to prefer people take personal responsibility over being able to deflect said responsibility.
Yeah, and I agree with that. I personally, my general cutoff, and obviously this is inside my brain, so it's not consistent, or there's no written down rule for this, but if it's an old policy stance, something that was from, say, 10 years ago, and then now a politician is saying, okay, well, I've shifted my view to this, and that's what the American people want, need, or deserve, or all three. I'm totally fine with that from either side, right?
So for clarity,
and
I don't think that you can never change your position on something. That's not what I mean.
No, and I'm not saying that that's what you're saying, and I'm going to get around to that in just a second.
Go ahead.
I tend to think that if somebody has said something within the past year as like a hard and fast, this is how I view this, I'm in support of this thing, and then they're getting backlash or something like that, and then they flip their view, that is obvious, that, like, hey, they said this thing, now they've got to course correct, and I don't necessarily know if I can trust that particular stance.
Okay, so
now
go ahead.
So, sorry, got just a little off topic, or derailed there. But I think that, like I said, if they have shifted their view, that they had several years ago or whatever, the best thing to do would be to explain that and say, yes, hey, I said this thing in the past. This is what I think now, and here's why. Here's why I think this is best for the American people. Here's why I think this is what the majority of Americans want, and, how we can find a middle ground between, what people on this side and people on the other side want. Obviously, that's never going to happen. That's just, my ideal. Like if both Donald Trump and Kamala Harris could come out and say that about all of the things they've switched their views on, I think we'd have a much more difficult time nailing down our decisions.
I think it would just be better for the American population. I think that...
No, I think so as well. And I mean, a difficult decision is what I want these days, you know?
Yeah, I think it's... And that was going to be my question to you, is you profess to want that, but the candidate that you're backing, at least to my knowledge, I guess I don't know if you've explicitly come out and said it or not, but has done exactly that thing where they flip-flopped on things that they've held for multiple years, and then they also say, my values haven't changed, but their policies changed with no explanation as to why their policies changed. It seems like pandering.
Yeah, and I think the specific issue that we're talking about, we've talked about off air, and I think that is one of those things where, you know, that was an older policy view that, you know, has...
To be clear, I don't think she's done that with just one thing. I think she's done that on multiple things.
Yeah, and I agree, but I don't think anything is, you know, extremely radical. I mean, you can talk about the border and gun control and all of these things, and I think there's definitely good evidence to back up a change in opinion on those things.
I'd love to see that evidence if you get a chance.
Gun control, I think specifically, if you're talking about that, was, you know... I don't want to get into the specifics of it right now because, again, we're short on time for this episode, and we could almost certainly make that a whole episode of its own. So, did you have anything else about Woodrow Wilson?
So yeah, if we're about to wrap, which I think given time we probably should, I do want to read his quote before we sign out. So the quote, the most notorious one he has, this also goes to cut back on when he said he never watched the movie, he didn't think it's not a racist movie, blah blah blah, he didn't know that it was a movie designed to bolster Ku Klux Klan membership or anything like that, even though it did, it created a second coming of the Ku Klux Klan. And the quote reads as follows, and this was in Birth of a Nation. So it was literally a slide that it cut to during the movie. So it reads as follows. The white men were roused by a mere instinct of self-preservation, until, at last, there had sprung into existence a great Ku Klux Klan, a veritable empire of the South, to protect the Southern country. That is a quote from him directly supporting the KKK and saying that they did it out of self-preservation, not out of horrific evil ideals. And there's multiple quotes in there from him, but that's the one that makes the news because to be quite honest, it doesn't drop the N-bomb nearly as much as the other ones. So, I mean, it's much more easily publicized than some of the other ones. And I'm not going to read some of the other ones because of its prolific use of the N-word. So, yeah, he's a blatant fucking racist. Let's try not to elect any more of those.
Yeah. I mean, I haven't personally watched the entirety of Birth of a Nation, but I think, like most people, I saw probably 10 to 15 minute clips of it in an American history class, but I don't think anybody could argue that wasn't just, you know, KKK racist propaganda.
That's literally all it was.
Absolutely. So, yeah, that was definitely very informative, and I learned a ton about Woodrow Wilson, so thank you for sharing all of that.
Absolutely. I'll rant about how much I hate that man anytime anyone asks me.
Yeah, maybe we can do a part 2 where we deep dive into
dude,
some of these.
We barely got into World War I at all. Things. We barely got into the meat of the policy, so I'm more than happy.
Yeah, we can talk about the conflict in Mexico and, you know, the things that happened during his second term. But
Oh, yeah.
keep an eye out for Woodrow Wilson Part 2. But yeah, with that, we're going to wrap it up here. So, like we always do, I love you, Drew.
I love you too, Mike. And thank you, everybody, for listening in. And until next time, we love you guys too. Take it easy.